Welcome to Inspire Change, a new inspirational and motivational broadcast that strives to empower men in a positive way, designed to educate, empower, and inspire even the busiest individual on the go over that first cup of coffee. Please join me in welcoming Gunter, international psychologist, author, speaker, and producer.
Welcome everybody to another episode of Inspire Change. So I want to carry on with where I started in the last episode of Inspire Change, which is inspiring change not at just an individual level, but also thinking about change from a bigger picture, a helicopter view, as it were. Because I really think that we really need to understand and be able to formulate where we are going to go, not just from an individual point or from my individual behaviour, but what it is that we want to do, or how we want to be together as a community. So the point that I was making in the last episode was that fundamentally patriarchy and democracy is an oxymoron. It actually can't coexist. The two are fundamentally incompatible, mainly because you cannot have a bipolar or a bipolarized social structure wherein there are the rulers and the ruled. Unfortunately, that's exactly what we've got. We have a system that pretends in many respects to be egalitarian and therefore democratic, but in practice, that's really not what we're getting. If we look at, say, for example, the UK, the United States, and now Australia, we have a system that is almost intentional within itself because of these contradictions. So let me put it together. In the last episode, I talked, about that whole issue about patriarchy and democracy. And in this episode, what I want to do is actually look at an important factor in the relationship between patriarchy, politics, that is, our political ideologies, and the issue of economics. Because my reading so far and my experience in our history, at least for the last 50 to 40 years, we need to acknowledge a very, very important shift that started to unfold during the 70s and 80s. And that is that we started to put in place collectively as a Western industrialized society an ideology, and a lot of people throw the word around, but I don't think they necessarily often contemplate what the import of that word is, and that's neoliberalism. Okay? And neoliberalism came about very early on in the piece, probably going back to the 1930s, the 1940s. But it seemed to have gotten its biggest foothold in the door when we started to look at the demise of Keynesian economics. There were lots of economic problems at the time, and a number of people, Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, Alan Greenspan, came in and began to talk about a different ideology. And there was a really interesting article written by a guy called Georges Monbiot. Now, I hope I'm not bastardizing that pronunciation. It could be something completely different. But he wrote an article called Neoliberalism, the ideology at the root of all our problems. And in that article, he observes that neoliberalism sees competition as the defining characteristic of human relations. Now, those of you who've paid attention, and I hope all of you have, one of my arguments is that competition is one of the central problems within gender relationships. as well as relationships in general and how we function in our society. And my definition of patriarchy rests on those four values, which is about, being territorial or tribal, hierarchical, that is, that we focus on status, that we're acquisitional, and that we're competitive. Now, you can apply all of these fundamentally to the idea of neoliberalism in one way or another. One of the problems that extends out of this neoliberalist attitude or ideology is that it redefines the citizen as a consumer whose democratic choices are exercised by buying and selling, a process that rewards merit and punishes inefficiency. Now, for those of you who've paid attention to some of my very early podcasts, to me, inefficiency is in fact a subset of effectiveness. I can be really efficient, but I don't necessarily need to be highly effective. But I'll cover that in more detail as I go along. So, already we have a problem in the relationship between equality, democracy, and neoliberalism. I am not by definition a consumer. I am a citizen. Therein we start with one of the problems, but the second problem is that there is a moral judgment implied in this, okay? And I'll get onto that a little bit later in a bit more detail. Now, neoliberalism also maintains that the market, which is somehow this entity, delivers benefits that could never be achieved by planning. In other words, we decentralise everything, we take rules out of it, we take regulations out of it, and somehow this system will self-regulate, apparently to the benefit of all. Did it happen that way? Well, history tells us that it's actually not working that well. So one of the moralisms in this is that any attempt to limit competition is treated as inimical to liberty. So they go on in practice to go tax and regulation should be minimised, public services should be privatised, and any effort to create a moral equal society are both counterproductive and morally corrosive. Interesting ideas. Now, my argument, and I liked the article very much. I think there's a lot in it. It's very detailed for what it does. Explanations about stuff. It really gets you thinking, and at least it stimulated me to want to read more in this area, especially his book. But one of the areas that I think he's not really mined further where he could have is that there is an intricate relationship between patriarchy and neoliberalism, especially around the values. Now, my argument is that both of them are ideologies that are married in its immorality to one another. You've got two systems which are fundamentally immoral. So, to rest their values on competition, right, so that those who are good at competing will reap the benefits, forgets that those who have already acquired, various levels of status, wealth, and position on a material basis are actually fundamentally got an edge on the rest of us. So you're already belonging to the right tribe, and that tribe seems to persuade itself that they have acquired all that they have through merit and continue to ignore the advantages that are bestowed on them through education, inheritance, and class. And that these have probably played a very important factor in their success. I always love the term the self-made billionaire. frankly, it's an absolute insult to anyone who works hard and doubly hard who's not become a billionaire, because the majority of the population works hard. You know, one of the things that always irritates me with neoliberalism is this suggestion that those who are not successful are somehow either morally defective or they simply don't know what to do. In other words, they're deficient in skills. My experience is that in most cases that's far from it. So we're not really a merit-based society. So I'm going to persist with this argument that the two are sort of married in this unholy relationship, patriarchy and neoliberalism. And what I find really interesting is that over 40 years, or maybe probably a bit more than 40 years, we seem to have accepted that neoliberalism, like patriarchy, is somehow a neutral force, a kind of biological law, someone like, you know, the theory of evolution. But that's not the case. As we're talking about it, it's an ideology, a philosophy about how individuals and culture work, how individuals within the society relate to one another. And it's been a really conscious attempt at social engineering. Now, unfortunately, this unholy marriage has had some significantly problematic consequences. And so let me tie this in to the issue about mental health, because ultimately that's at the bottom of a lot of this, is where we're going, okay, as an individual, as a male, firstly I need to deconstruct patriarchy and look at my masculinity through a different lens, something that is more egalitarian, and therefore gives me an opportunity to perceive our society in a more democratic way. The second bit is that neoliberalism is the same. I need to sort of go and take a really close look at it and go, okay, what's the problem here? We've been sold something like, for example, the trickle-down economy that in fact has never, ever delivered its promise. One of the things that we've seen is that the conditions of the worker has significantly eroded, but the acquisition of wealth in the upper 1 to 5% has risen exponentially. And there's some reasons for that, and I could go into those and may do in a later podcast. But right now what I want to convey is the importance of how this affects the individual in their mental health, because that's always, in my experience, pushed, to the individual, that somehow your mental health is completely and totally your responsibility, and the situation that you find yourself in has very little to do with it. In other words, if you're anxious, depressed, suffering somehow in distress or from a disorder, it's naturally your problem. It's, dispositional. Society or the context that you find yourself in, the system has nothing to do with it. And I argue this. And it's not just me. There's a whole bunch of people out there who argue very strongly along those lines. Paul Verhaeghe documents this in his book, What About Me?, where he describes that the consequences of neoliberalism fundamentally have been epidemics of self-harm, eating disorders, depression, loneliness, performance anxiety, and social phobia. If we go back to patriarchy, the British Psychological Society explains that the construction of masculinities is believed to be one of the most important factors influencing the way in which suicide is discussed and contemplated and enacted by men. Now, neoliberalism actually takes on a less gender-biased approach. doesn't matter really whether you're male or female, as long as you're a good consumer and you participate and drink the Kool-Aid. So yes, as you can hear in my tone, I'm extremely critical of the social engineering that took us down this path, because it's a philosophy and ideology that has allowed politicians that are essentially strongmen to emerge much, much more forcefully, and they've done so by splitting our communities, by creating an us versus them. Those of us who have and those who don't. And those who don't, it's because they don't work enough, they don't, acquire skills enough, they're not smart enough, they're not diligent enough. And my argument is that that is the furthest thing in most cases from the truth. I saw an interesting thing, must have been on Facebook, where they had some statistics about applicants for jobs in relationship to the offered remuneration. And the lowest paid jobs actually attracted the least number of applicants. But when an appropriate level of remuneration was offered, people went for the job. Now, to me, that's a no-brainer. Why would I take something where essentially I'm being treated as a slave? Because that's what it is. It's just, during the times of slavery, people were sold and bought, and they were given food, shelter, varying quality, but they were expected to deliver their labour simply on that. There was no financial remuneration. There was no progression, social progression, or professional progression, or even just a sort of getting into a better place in your community. You were always a slave, and you couldn't get out of it. It was a one-stop shop, and that is a further immorality. Unfortunately, there are many, many people in our society who unfortunately are subjected to that model. It's not that we use that language, but the gig economy makes sure that people are financially and economically disadvantaged in any attempt to progress in the acquisition of wealth or professional career. So some pretty heavy thinking here, but I want to stimulate people to start looking at where are our historical turning points as much as where's my individual turning point. Do I really want to perpetuate inequities, immoralities, and keeping people in a place of disadvantage? Because ultimately, those of us who are going to pay the price are our children and grandchildren. And as a grandparent, I'm very conscious of that, because I want to leave behind not just the same place, but a better place as much as I can. So until next time, think about how you can inspire change and growth in yourself and in your community and in how you think about things. Until next time, this is me signing off.
Thank you for listening to Inspire Change with Gunter. Gunter Swoboda does individual and group coaching for men looking to grow. For more information on this and the global Making Good Men Great movement, check out goodmengreat.com to get into contact. If you have a topic for the show or would like to be a guest on the air, please email producers at miranda@noirtainment.com. That's Miranda, Miranda, at noirtainment, noirtainment.com. Thank you, and always keep inspiring change.